So I'm going to start off today by telling you a story about a yesterday. So it was an early spring day in 1998. I had just moved to Boston, right across the river actually, and I was an enthusiastic graduate from the University of Pennsylvania. I was working at the Cancer Clinical Trials Unit at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center as a research coordinator. So my job was to run the clinical studies that were sponsored by pharmaceutical companies and to liaise between the principal investigators that were running them and the patients that were participating in them. And I was really to ensure the accurate and timely collection of the data that made up those clinical trials. Now, one of our best enrolling clinical trials was a lung cancer study. It was called ECOG 1594. And the standard of care at that time, again, remember it's before 2000, was chemotherapy doublet combination. And generally there are about 4 of these chemo doublets that oncologists had to choose from, and they generally chose the one that loosely fit criteria based on those patient characteristics, but really they just picked the one that they were most comfortable or familiar with. But the challenge is that nobody actually knew which one of these regimens was best. And the ECOG 1594 study was designed to answer that question. Now, on this trial, we had a patient. His name was Richard, and he was my favorite patient enrolled in this study. He was a middle-aged man from Taunton. And on his first appointment to screen for the clinical trial, he showed up with his girlfriend and his sister. Now, despite the fact that he had a stage 4 cancer diagnosis that has very poor prognosis, Richard was in great spirits, and he and his crew, they laughed and they joked and seemed to enjoy the entire experience. It was so great to see somebody have that type of reaction at a very deep point in his life. Now, Richard and I got to know each other very well over the course of the coming months. And this was especially true as I helped him fill out the ridiculous number of quality of life questionnaires that he had to fill out as part of the study. So in doing so, he would tell me stories about his life and especially his love life. And he would also ask me about my love life. And trust me, it wasn't very exciting. But the reality is that something very intimate develops between people when they are at their most vulnerable. And in my case, also the most impressionable. And as the weeks passed, and Richard returned for more and more appointments, his girlfriend stopped coming. And eventually, so did his sister. Richard was completely alone. So you see, the stigma around lung cancer is truly awful. Patients get blamed for bringing the disease on themselves, and it is not uncommon for them to be abandoned by their loved ones. It's really tragic. And there was no more laughter at Richard's appointments anymore, and I really shared in this feeling of hopelessness and loneliness in the remaining visits he had. So a few months into his treatment on study, Richard experienced a severe febrile neutropenia and a pleural effusion. And he ended up in the ICU. Now, in my job as the research coordinator for the study, I knew this was a serious adverse event. And my role was to make sure that I could record the vitals and the labs and any interventions that he received, because that was what was required for the clinical trial. So I knew that the best way for me to do it was to go myself, review the records, record the information that I needed, and that's exactly what I did. And when I arrived, I found a version of Richard that I never expected. He was unconscious, almost lifeless, and connected to more tubes and machines than I've ever seen before in my life. it was really disheartening. After a few minutes of me rustling around papers and trying to get the information that I needed, a shockingly loud alarm goes off. Richard was in cardiac arrest. The medical team from the hallway rushes in, and they inform me that Richard has signed a DNR, a do not resuscitate, and that there was nothing that they can do for him. So as we sat there, we waited, and in a few moments, I hear the flatline, the alarms are deactivated, the medical team leaves the room, and it's in that moment that I realized that Richard came into the ICU alone, and with wild eyes, I went and I grabbed his hand and I said, "He is not leaving alone." And it was there in that moment of absolute silence, being with him at his side during his final moments, that I realized something truly important. That at the end of the day, what is so critical in the work that we do is this: patients deserve better. And at that moment is really when I vowed to amplify the voices of patients and to dedicate my career to helping to ensure that we can bring better medicines to patients faster. And if there was a role that I could play in making that happen, that's what I wanted to do. So this was the moment in the very early part of my career that sparked the career in drug development that I had after that time. So I found my way from the ICU to big pharma. And over the next years, I've had the privilege of working on several programs that have truly reshaped the treatment paradigm across a number of different cancers. It's really been a humbling experience. Now let me share with you an example of this. So I'll go back to lung cancer, where we've started, and remember ECOG 1594. This is the clinical trial that Richard was on. So these are the final results, the survival results from that study. And for those of you that are less familiar with reading a Kaplan-Meier curve, what you can see here is all 4 of those treatment arms, they overlap with each other. And when that happens, there's no difference. One is not better than the other. They're all equally the same. And you also see that each one of those lines gravitates to the x-axis. And when you see that, that means patients are dying. In fact, all of these patients died. And Richard was 1 point on one of those lines, but the reality is that there were hundreds and thousands of patients who all make up those lines who weren't benefiting from this therapy really at all. But my time in big pharma allowed me to see innovation within this space. I had the real privilege to work on the dawn of immunotherapy in lung, able to increase that by 5 times with immunotherapies. That might not seem a lot because it's still pretty low, but it's a big difference if you happen to be one of those patients and happen to have a loved one who is one of those patients. And then the dawn of targeted therapies, where instead of having single digits or teens surviving, we now have over 40% of patients surviving long-term with these therapies. That's huge in this population. So my time in big pharma really allowed me to feel like I was making a big impact. I worked on massive patient populations across global geographies, and it felt great to make a difference. But life is not all roses and puppy dogs in pharma either. And we've all heard about these looming patent cliffs that are associated with the major blockbusters within the industry. And when you're burdened with these patent cliffs, some of the observations that I experienced is shying away from being bold in innovation, choosing to invest in safer bets and taking less risk. And the reason for that is because when you take more risk, you could create even further gaps in a P&L. And when you've got that P&L with these looming patent cliffs, it's really hard to manage. So there's this undercurrent of, are we being innovative enough? Can we be doing more for patients? Perhaps. So let's fast forward to May of 2020. Now, all of you will remember, this is the height of the global COVID-19 pandemic. Many of us were in lockdown. I certainly was. And here, this picture was taken on the 15th of May. It's my son Caffrey's 10th birthday. So in the backdrop of my career in large pharma, my family was undergoing what we call a diagnostic odyssey. So this is the journey that one takes when you know something's not quite right, but you don't know exactly what it is and nobody can tell you. That's what was happening for the last 10 years. But on this particular day, and in fact here, as we made the strawberry shortcake for his special day, a few hours later, just a few hours later after this picture was taken, my husband walks into the office where I was working and on a perpetual Zoom call. And he tells me that the genetic tests that we submitted for Caffrey just a few weeks earlier came back and confirmed a diagnosis of Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Now, for those of you that don't know what Duchenne muscular dystrophy is, and that's okay because I didn't either at that time, this is a progressive, muscle-wasting disease. It will rob Caffrey of his ability to walk. It will then impact his breathing. He may have to be on a ventilator, and then it will ultimately ravage his heart. There is no cure, and it is 100% fatal with a truncated life expectancy. It was really impossible to fathom that my not even teenage boy may have lived half his life. But I was a pharma exec. I know about drug development. There's something that I can do about this. And I knew that my teams were working tirelessly to bring innovations to patients with cancer. I had to believe that there were teams just as good, working just as hard to find a cure for Duchenne, and I was going to find those people. So I rolled up my sleeves and I began that work. So first of all, it was bad enough that I find out that the standard of care, the decades-long standard of care, and still the standard of care today, is high-dose steroids. It does a little bit to slow the progression of his disease, but it does nothing, actually, to address the underlying genetic cause. But I thought, okay, well, there's got to be clinical trials. There has to be new innovations that are being explored. And surely that would be the case. And having run and designed many clinical trials myself, I knew this could be his best chance at survival. But you can imagine my horror when, after an exhaustive search on clinicaltrials.gov, that I found out that he was eligible for exactly zero clinical trials. How could this be the case? It quickly sank into me that Caffrey would be one of millions of patients with a rare disease that were overlooked and left behind. Caffrey was on borrowed time, and as a family, we felt marooned, alone, and really scared. I'm really at a loss to describe that sheer feeling of hopelessness and grief that comes when your child gets a catastrophic diagnosis. It can be all-consuming and soul-destroying. And one of the first glimmers of hope during this time is when I found out about Alltrna, and I met the amazing team of female co-founders behind this company. I really immediately understood the potential of this platform and could see how Alltrna's engineered tRNAs could truly be a lifeline for patients with thousands of genetic diseases, and a lifeline for those families that love them. Families not very different from my own. In fact, very, very much the same. This was an opportunity for me to channel all my years in big pharma and to take that drug development and really bring it towards those overlooked and underserved patient populations. In the last 2 decades, I can look back and feel like I've played a small, but maybe a meaningful role in helping to advance the 5-year survival rates for cancers, for many metastatic cancers, and make those better. Can you imagine if in the next 2 decades we can do the same for rare diseases? Looking out for the overlooked is a huge motivator for me. So being the CEO of a startup company, especially a startup biotech company here at Flagship, is a rewarding and refreshing change from my experience in pharma. So for the first time in years, I feel as though I have the opportunity to be back on the bleeding edge, really pushing the boundaries of science way, way, way beyond the imagination. But it can't be science for science's sake. It has to be science for an impact. And the impact that I believe all of us at Alltrna are driving towards is to fundamentally transform clinical practice for the millions of patients with genetic diseases. And that's hugely exciting for me. So I started off this talk with a story about a yesterday. And now I'm going to conclude with a story about tomorrow. And in fact, it actually is tomorrow, February 8th. I will be taking my son to UMass Chan for his biannual visit to the Duchenne Clinic. And there, he will give a lot of blood. He will take about 4 or 5 different scans. He's going to meet with pulmonology, cardiology, endocrinology, nutrition, psych, physical therapy, all of those specialists. We are then going to sit down with Dr. Brenda Wong. Now, she's one of the preeminent neuromuscular experts in the world. And we're going to sit with her for, I'm going to say, at least an hour and a half, because that's what she gives to her patients. So during that time, we're going to talk about Caffrey's status and how he's been doing over the last 6 months. And usually he does pretty well. This time, I'm bracing myself. Because knowing that Caffrey has broken not 1, but 2 legs over the course of the last month makes me really realize that we are very, very rapidly approaching this non-ambulatory phase of this disease. It's grueling. But it's not just the bone density and the fractures and his not maybe being ambulatory. The medication that he's on, the steroids, also takes its toll. So remember this happy kid, 10 years old on his birthday, just before diagnosis? Well, here he is, 1 year later on his 11th birthday. You can see the weight gain that he's experienced during that time. And then 1 more year, 12 years old. It's very obvious the steroids having an effect on his weight and his body mass index. But it's also not weight. As I mentioned, it's bone density with the fractures. It's stunting his growth, where he has multiple compressions in his spine that is keeping him from getting tall. Here he is with his sister. She's 1.5 years younger than him. And you can see how she towers over him in this photograph. After we catch up on all of this with Caffrey, we'll start talking about new innovations on the horizon. We'll talk about what the big pharma companies are doing. And there's a bit, not a lot, a bit. And some of that is dwindling as different investment choices have to be made at these companies. But then we'll also talk about some of the interesting, promising new technologies that are really trying to push the boundaries within these different biotechs. And that'll give me hope, that's for sure. Although likely of any of these technologies really benefiting my son remains to be seen. And once we finish all of that, what'll be really interesting is that Dr. Wong will start to ask me about how things are going at Alltrna. You see, Dr. Wong can also see what I see. She will see that engineered tRNAs could be a massively differentiated offering to patients with genetic diseases, and particularly Duchenne's. So microdystrophin gene therapy, which was approved last year, has serious limitations, actually, and serious risks associated with it. And the gene editing that was dosed in one patient with Duchenne proved to be fatal. So we need to do more and we need to do better. But the possibility of restoring a full-length functional dystrophin protein, that could be a game changer for the Duchenne community. So tomorrow, I will get to be the patient advocate, the pharma exec, the biotech CEO, and the parent, always the parent, all in one. So what are the lessons that I take away from this whole experience? First and foremost, lead with empathy and always think about the patient at the center of what we do. Drive innovation. Don't wait for it to happen. You have to drive it forwards. You have to actively choose to make a difference in those bold choices that really make innovation matter. Take risks. Those safe bets aren't helping anyone. You got to take the risks to really make a difference for patients. Act with urgency, as if your kid's life depends on it. And also, really importantly, embrace who you are. I just had this conversation a few minutes ago about, how do you compartmentalize who you are at any given time? And the reality is, I don't. I tried, and now I don't. I embrace who I am. Take it or leave it. But most importantly, at the end of the day, always, always, always remember, patients deserve better. Thank you.